Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. As a bit of introduction and context for our presentations, Anna, Tim, and I originally came together as research fellows in 2018 and 2019 to work on Tony Bebbington's Laureate Fellowship. The remit of the laureate was to conduct and contribute to, quote, human environment theory building, specifically by conducting comparative research on mining, society, and environment under conditions of climate change. The geographic areas of focus for the fellowship were Latin America and Australasia. And although that formal laureate project has since dissolved, the three of us have purposely retained our collaborative research group under the mentorship of Professor Uma Kathari. Together and independently, we continue to conduct work that looks broadly at the impacts of extractive activities in these same geographic regions, including Australia, Indonesia, Chile, Colombia, and Argentina. And the work we're presenting today is based on this ongoing work. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about my work on the impacts of mining and mine closure governance, and then some preliminary results of my more recent work in Colombia. In 2019, I spent a few months rather, doing field work in Colombia and Chile, conducting field research for this project. My areas of focus are the coal mining regions of northern Colombia and the copper mining region of Antofagasta in Chile. These pictures are from site visits to various closed, inactive, abandoned, or mines in the process of closing. My work centers on questions about the ways that mine closure governance might facilitate more inclusive development in the post-mining period. I focus on mechanisms that support social justice, equity, and public participation when it comes to making decisions about what happens to lands, waters, and people's livelihoods after a mine closes. Mine closure is sometimes presented as a straightforward and mostly technical process, just another step in the mine life cycle. As you can see from this diagram, mining starts with exploration and the development of the mine site or operation. And as this diagram also indicates, closure is then sort of a predetermined process that makes everything clean and green and usable again. But of course, that's not always the way it is. It's not always so straightforward. In part, this is sometimes because we're talking about really big operations. This is the Chuqui mine in northern Chile with the Evergreen, that cargo ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, here for scale. This operation employs thousands of people in a mining-dependent region. This table emphasizes the summarizes the kind of state of play of mine closure legislation in the Andean region from a paper I published earlier this year. If you focus on Colombia here, you can see that mining in the country represents a relatively small but significant portion of the national GDP, somewhere around 4%. The country maintains a very long history of coal mining and is one of the world's biggest exporters of coal. Colombia's national development plans tend to place mining as central to economic development and poverty reduction. And of course, this is situated in the context of more than 50 years of ongoing armed conflict and attempts to reach some kind of peace. All this to say that mine closure has not been a significant component of extractive governance in Colombia until very recently. In 2019, however, two mine closure-specific bills were put forward for debate in Congress, outlining stipulations for mine closure that went far beyond what current legislation requires, and including social considerations or socioeconomic dimensions. But then COVID came, and specifically COVID-19. COVID-19 has had two interrelated impacts on this work. First, it has ensured that mine closure is of increasingly limited concern in Colombia in comparison to the opening and continuing operation of mines. And second, of course, relatedly, I haven't been able to return to Colombia since 2019. And so I've had to alter the course of my research focus as well. What I'm presenting is based on my work with an in-country research team. We're all conducting work remotely now, and one of our side projects is looking at the impacts of COVID-19, specifically on mining governance. The first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in Colombia on March 6, 2020. 6 days later, after the World Health Organization officially declared COVID-19 a pandemic, President Duque declared a state of economic, social, and ecological emergency. This is still in place today. Since the start of the pandemic, the country's GDP has dropped almost 7%, and Colombia had the highest recorded rate of unemployment in Latin America in 2020, bringing complete and what I think are often dangerous forms of precarity. Overall, Colombia has at various times had one of the highest infections rates in the world, and more than 3 million cases have now been recorded. The bottom half of this figure is one I've shown before, outlining the various intersecting challenges to mining governance in Colombia. The COVID-19 pandemic has intensified many of these challenges, as well as added new ones. Significant drops in the price of coal, regulatory rollbacks and emergency measures for the sake of economic recovery, and ongoing and lately a significant increase in violence all add additional challenges to mining governance, as well as to short and long-term possibilities for inclusive development. I'll outline these in a bit more detail. First, emergency measures and regulatory rollbacks. Dramatic economic changes have created a means for the Colombian state to reinforce the role of the extractive sector in, quote, economic recovery and reactivation. First, the Ministry of Interior proposed early in the pandemic that prior consultations with Indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities should be conducted online rather than in person, and that consultation procedures needed to be simplified or completely removed. In this instance, that recommendation was rejected, but similar rollbacks have passed. For example, a later legislative decree reduces the costs that companies incur when conducting impact assessments and community consultations. Other measures include the Ministry of Mines and Energy determining the distribution of resource royalties among municipalities without requiring identification of where exactly extracted resources are coming from. This has encouraged an increase in extractive activities among small-scale miners, much of whose activity is, in non-pandemic times, classified as illegal or criminal. And later, more formally, with the establishment of the royalties law, this doubles the allocation of resource royalties to municipalities where mining resources are located and extracted. The National Planning Department stated that, quote, the resources of the royalties from the production of minerals and hydrocarbons will drive the economic reactivation of the regions. Colombia is the world's 5th largest exporter of coal. Prior to the pandemic, the continuing drop in international coal prices, combined with energy transition processes that Anna speaks to a bit later, had already caused a steep decline in operations. Nonetheless, these factors have all accelerated as a result of COVID-19. Although coal mining was exempt from coronavirus restrictions, the country's major coal producers closed operations briefly at the start of the pandemic. Restarting operations has been met with significant opposition, particularly from local communities who continue to be concerned about the ease with which mining operations could bring COVID-19 to rural areas. In August 2020, Cerrejón, one of the largest coal mining operations in South America, was forced to halt operations as workers went on strike after being asked to work the so-called shift of death, a shift which was part of Cerrejón's rationale to stay competitive, that is, to reduce costs amidst extremely low market prices. Whether or not mines owned by Prodeco, Glencore, CNR, and others continue to operate directly affects the share of royalties that flow to municipalities where mines are located. For some of the people we interviewed for this project, this was clearly understood as a strategy by the mining sector to force the hand of the state to make regulatory and legislative changes that favor the expansion of the extractive sector, as well as increase economic support for the sector in the form of subsidies. These changes in coal markets and economic pressures also help explain the very high levels of violence being experienced by rural and urban peoples alike in Colombia. Despite the signing of the peace agreement in 2016, Colombia was called one of the most dangerous places in the world for land and territory rights defender in 2019. In 2020, more than 50 people were killed advocating for or defending these rights. Special permissions for the extractive sector to continue operating through COVID-19 lockdowns have been met with increased violence. Several community leaders shared with us that they viewed the lockdown measures as a cover for uses of force and extreme violence against people who pose a threat to lucrative economies like mining. With most people spending significant periods inside their houses during lockdowns and with otherwise normal security protocols upended, non-state and state actors alike have been able to act without impunity, or often without impunity. More recent violence began at the end of April now 2 months ago, erupting first with the introduction of a tax reform bill. Although the bill has since been withdrawn, the protests and corresponding violence have become a much bigger beast. More than 40 people have been killed in these ongoing protests, and the protests are now about a range of themes, including the use of excessive force by riot police, and more broadly, state-sanctioned violence, violence against women, and Indigenous land rights. It seems that the dramatic changes wrought by COVID-19 have created a means for the Colombian state to double down on an extractivist agenda, with the mining sector in particular playing a prominent role. Economic recovery as an essential task also reinforces notions of national mining dependence, but these changes serve to exacerbate extreme inequalities, disable or at least seriously undermine consultation-based and participatory mechanisms, and enable growing violence against, or at least the dispossession of, people who may pose a challenge to the expansion of the extractive sector. And thus, all of this flies in the face of hopes for inclusive development or efforts at lasting peace. In planning for a post-pandemic world that is hopefully imminent, this emphasizes the need for concerted efforts at institution building that enhances territorial equity rather than amplifies and capitalizes on massive inequalities, as is playing out now. Thank you.
All right. My name's Tim. I'm going to present my take on some mining issues as they play out in Australia and Indonesia. And the way I'm approaching these issues is primarily as a spatial analyst. So the aims of my research project is to be able to understand mining as a spatial phenomenon. And I aim to map the spread of impacts of mining at local, regional, and global scales, and see how this exercise of mapping out the spread of mining activity and the impacts they're having can help us govern them better. So I use satellite imagery, I use GIS tools, and I focus very heavily on collecting and building large data sets on mining activity globally. And I look a lot at reports that mining companies are producing and see if I can extract useful data out of them. So Jill was talking a lot about mine closure as an issue, and related to that, I'm looking at abandoned mines in Australia. We're probably all very aware that mining is very key to the Australian economy. We export something like $15 billion worth of mined goods every month. Constitutes about half of our export revenue. And a consequence of our long mining history is a massive environmental legacy. And some estimates in the past have been that we have something like 50,000 abandoned mine sites around Australia. In 2017, there was a Senate inquiry that was looking into what role the Commonwealth government has in addressing abandoned mines in Australia. And basically the inquiry recognised that yes, the federal government does have a role to play, even though mining is an issue that's normally handled at the state level. But the information that would enable the federal government to act in any way was missing, because the states were controlling all of the data and they had different reporting mechanisms. And so trying to build a national picture of abandoned mines was a challenge. And that's what my study sought to address. And to start with, we had to come up with a classification scheme. And we built on one that was developed in Canada. So that's the NOAMI classification scheme system. But we basically added a few extra categories to account for different kinds of abandoned mines or inactive mines. So they might be in care and maintenance, which means they're just plodding along. They're not really suitable for rehabilitation because the mining company thinks, well, we might start up mining sometime in the future. Or they might be considered a heritage site, or they might actually have been rehabilitated already, in which case we would want to know the difference. So we called our system MIDAS, which was the Mining Incidents Documentation and Assessment Scheme. And we essentially went through all of the state level reports, went through a process of harmonization, removing duplicates, trying to identify the locations of all of these sites where that wasn't reported, and trying to sort of put them into one kind of consistent database. And this was the kind of picture that we came up with. And you can see some interesting differences between the states. So you can see some states are reporting where rehabilitation has actually taken place. Some don't have any categories for aspects like this. And I suppose the overall takeaway was that there are, in fact, closer to 80,000 abandoned mine sites around Australia. When you actually map them out, you can see kind of the scale of the challenge that we're facing in Australia. And you can also perhaps see where you have reporting biases between the states. So it really does look like New South Wales and Victoria have perhaps a more comprehensive database than some of the other states do. Yeah. So blue is inactive mines, and where it's purple is basically where there's active and inactive mine sites in the same area. So that's just where they're overlapping. Yeah. When we zoom in, it starts to become kind of more interesting to think about, okay, what does the location actually mean? How does the location of these abandoned sites relate to sensitive areas like human populations or national parks or important wetlands? How close are they to road and rail networks, such that if we did actually want to go and rehabilitate these sites, how easily could we access them? So that was kind of the next exercise, was to do some mapping of what's the proximity of these sites to sensitive areas, how close are they to transport networks, how are they located in terms of acid sulfate soils. So a common problem with abandoned mines is that when you've dug up soil that contains sulfates and then that gets exposed to rainfall, it then starts to generate sulfuric acid, which then leaches into waterways and destroys the ecosystems. So if we have a look at acid sulfate presence and rainfall in relation to where these abandoned mines are, we can perhaps start to build a risk profile for where we might target investments for rehabilitation or to reduce this acid mine drainage risk. So the aim of the study was just to provide some kind of baseline for how the federal government might start to target its interventions. A key takeaway from this was that only roughly 3,000 sites have been reported as being rehabilitated. So that kind of gives us a goalpost for how much rehabilitation may actually need to take place. But of course, an ongoing challenge is that even if considerable resources and expertise are allocated to prioritize and conduct rehabilitation efforts, there's no guarantee that they will actually be successful. So there are a few high-profile cases of where large sums of money have been allocated to rehabilitate mine sites, and then 10 or so years later, the problems still persist. So we don't have an amazing track record of actually proving that we can do it successfully in Australia. Yeah, so that was one approach to looking at mining issues at a national level. And this is kind of a deeper dive into mapping out mining impacts for a very specific issue in a more specific case. And this relates to coal mining in East Kalimantan, which is on the island of Borneo in Indonesia. And East Kalimantan is a major coal producing region. It's a really, it's a major factor in Indonesia being the largest exporter of thermal coal. It has a population of roughly 3.6 million people, but that population is going to grow substantially because it is going to be the site of Indonesia's future capital city. Coal mining is such a problem in this region. It is so widespread, and it has been the cause of 37 drownings, mostly of children, in recent years. So I wanted to sort of map out the scale of coal mining in this region and also the drownings that were occurring. So I started off looking at media reports and actually trying to pinpoint where the drownings actually happened. And then I also looked at satellite imagery to look at the actual land occupied by coal mining activity, which is in brown here, and see how that relates to where people are actually living, which is in yellow. And essentially you can see that where you have really highly interposing areas of coal and human settlement, then perhaps unsurprisingly, you see a cluster of where the drownings are actually taking place. And the red areas here is the actual coal permit areas. So this is highlighting essentially a systematic regulatory issue in terms of how they're actually allocating where the coal mining can occur. Another thing we can do is we can look at where water bodies are emerging. So we can look at the satellite imagery and we can see, okay, across the province, where are new water bodies emerging within coal areas, and what does that mean for how extensive the risk is across the whole province? And we can actually pinpoint which water bodies are parts of mines and which have emerged since the concession was granted. I was also looking at regulatory issues. So to what extent is mining activity staying within its allocated legal boundaries, or operating outside of those boundaries? So here the red areas is where you've got coal mining activity that's taking place outside of their legal boundaries. On this side it shows where the boundaries have been allocated that overlap where people live. So on the one hand, you've got a problem with how they're granting coal mining permits. And on the other hand, you've got instances where they don't even adhere to those permits anyway. So it's really just highlighting systemic regulatory failures across this whole province. And just to wrap up, so I've started with kind of like a national level look and then zoom into more of a specific issue. But to zoom all the way out and try and understand patterns of mining around the globe. Last year I presented a study that was looking at mapping 300 mine sites around the world. They were sort of the major mines that represented the majority of production of a lot of metals. But a study that we just submitted is mapping 24,600 mine area polygons across 117 countries. It's not quite this level of detail where we separate between the specific features of the mine. We just sort of aim to look at, okay, what's the actual footprint of the mine? And what's interesting about this is that while we were doing this study, someone else in Austria was doing basically exactly the same thing. And we have a really unique opportunity to compare our results. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but his study outlined areas in red and the areas that we outlined are in blue. So he was focused more on just like what's the overall footprint, and we were focused on what is the area occupied by the specific features of the mine. It's just interesting to think for a second about what is the actual footprint of a mine. What impact is it actually having on land? And doing these kind of comparative studies can help us build a kind of a more sophisticated understanding of spatial patterns in mine area growth. Yeah, that's me. Thanks.
I'm going to try and be as fast as I can so that we have some time for questions. So the project that brought me here today looks on the current lithium mining boom happening in Latin America, trying to understand the opportunities and challenges that are connected to the expansion of renewable energy. In that sense, the project is trying to analyze the imaginaries of the energy transition that may serve as a bridge to connect the push to renewable energy in the global north, Australia included, and the global south, and to trace in what ways the lithium mining industry may give us an insight to that. So I was supposed to conduct the most substantial part of my fieldwork in Argentina in 2020. You can imagine how that went. So instead, I had to be creative and restructure the project to be conducted remotely as much as possible. This has led to two approaches that I will try to share with you today that are both animated by the same kind of questions. And I like to start always my presentations with this picture here. This picture was taken in my first trip to the salt flats in Bolivia in 2008. There are many salt flats in the regions high in the Andes Mountains, and this one was taken in upon entering the Uyuni salt flat, the largest in the world. I visited on a January morning after an evening rain had left a thin layer of water on the salt flat surface. This blurry picture, taken with my first ever digital camera, falls considerably short of the breathtaking sense of wonder and magic that invaded me when I set foot on the salt flat and observed how the reflection of the sky in the mirror of water blurred with the boundaries of the horizon. Many years later, my attention to the salt flats and that of many others would be captivated by another kind of magic. Underneath those layers of salt lie some of the most precious brines with the highest concentration of lithium in the world. So I want to start introducing my research by presenting to you some of the work that we have been doing as a team together with Jill and Tim, actually, that gives an overview to some of the most pressing multidimensional issues that are highlighted by the expansion of the mining lithium industry in Argentina. So I've already mentioned, my research is happening in an area known as the Lithium Triangle, which comprises the north of Argentina, the north of Chile, and the south of Bolivia, where almost 60% of the world lithium is located. The map and the quotation are from a presentation of an Australian company called Gillian Lithium, which considers this the best neighborhood for lithium brines in the world. And they're not the only one. The current lithium mining boom, also dubbed a white gold rush, is expanding throughout the region, but it is particularly strong in Argentina. Lithium mining projects in the country have jumped from 2 active mines in 2008 to currently 52 projects at different stages, 20 of them at an advanced stage. This map gives some way of introduction to this expansion. And to the left, the map is showing the salt flats in the area in yellow and some of the mine projects, the most advanced ones, in red dots. To the right is one of the maps that we actually have built that show the mining concession permits only for lithium mining. This is a mining area. There are other mining concessions. These are only for mining. And as you can see, it occupies a very large space. Our work has been collecting, managing, and compiling some of the diverse spatial data sets that are connected to lithium mining from several government bodies and research institutions. We are particularly interested in understanding the extent in which the allocation of this lithium mining permits interacts with spatial environmental regulation and protected areas, particularly also with the emergence of new sources of water bodies, both natural and anthropogenic, and protected wetlands as a mean of exploring some of the conflicts and multidimensional issues that are associated with the lithium mining industry. Sorry, I just moved another computer. A lot of the challenges are rooted in the fact that this is a relatively new mining industry and it's very poorly understood. The extraction of lithium carbonates in this area mainly happens from the brines and occurs through evaporation. So you can see here the 2 main projects. Those are the evaporation ponds of the Salar de Alaroz lithium mine, which is managed by Oro Cobre, an Australian company, And on the other side, you can see the Salar de Hombre Muerto. It's an aerial view, and you can see the massive evaporation ponds as well. This is a company this is a mine from Leiden called Phoenix Mine. So the extraction of lithium carbonate from brines occurs through evaporation and is presented as an ostensibly less invasive and less polluting process compared to the open pit mines operating in the area for other minerals. This has an aura of green production, which is coupled with discourses centered on the centrality and the key role of lithium for enabling the transition to a greener post-carbon future, have elicited many responses from the communities and the industries. However, in the field, there is very little understanding of what precisely are the impacts of this industry. Among other things, there is very little data available to create baselines to understand what are the environmental impacts that the mining is likely to produce in the area. We have produced some other maps, and I'm sharing you a couple of them here. This is showing how some of the, we can talk about them more later, but it's showing how this lithium mining permits are clashing with different environmental regulations. You can see some lithium mining permits given in glacier areas that are protected by a 2010 law. This is protecting, these areas, red, green, and yellow, are showing the left of what is left of the native forest, and the red area is an area that is where no activity is supposed to happen. Yet you have actually these are all Australian companies that own all those permits over there. These are also this is a map showing the water transitions and the creation and the emergence of new water bodies and the disappearance of some other water areas in the region. However, there is very little hard evidence to evaluate the impacts that mining has already had in the area. This is a very convenient fact for both the companies and the pro-mining governments in the area. But however, in an extremely arid area of Argentina, this lack of evidence has not stopped many of the communities to protest and be wary of the indiscriminate use of water. All the protests here are around water. For people who are interested in climate, this is an area that has less than, on average, the entire region, less than 200 millimeters of precipitation per year. And Capato, the town that I'm going to talk about now, has an average of 64 millimeters of rainfall per year. So a lot of my research relies on fieldwork, and I had planned on conducting that for several months in 2020. As this has not been possible, I had been working with a partner institution, particularly the National Institute for Non-Conventional Energy at the University of Salta, and with a research team in the country, coordinating interviews in some of the most remote areas and participating at them via Zoom at strange times in the middle of the night sometimes. These interviews have focused on exploring the imaginaries of transition that are held across the different actors in this industry, and the way in which the different narratives articulated in this underpin, facilitate, or challenge the expansion of the industry. We're interested in understanding what are the narratives that these imaginaries are built upon, and what are the ones that are sidelined, and what do these sidelined imaginaries can tell us of the energy transition. To share a little bit, I thought I was going to talk about just one town that we went to visit, and this is this town. In this picture, you can see the little town of Olacapato. It is located in the province of Salta, though there is a dispute around there, and approximately 300 people live there. The town is located at 4,000 meters above the sea level. It is a very remote area where almost no public transport exists, and it is a town whose history has been marked by mining of various other metals, but most prominently borax. It has a dual system of governance. Both indigenous and official government authorities share a very fragile decision-making space that they may have around these issues, and coexisting in a precarious space of cooperation. It is home to the indigenous community of Kewar Etnia Koja, and holds the traditional ownership of the salt flats located nearby, particularly the Salar del Rincón. This, as you may have guessed, is an extremely impoverished area in Argentina, where little formal employment exists, and where the communities develop a variety of economic activities, some connected to traditional salt harvesting, some to pastoralism, and of course, activities related to the mines in the region. The town has only in the last year started having 24 hours supply of electricity generated by diesel. The people complained to us about the inconsistencies of energy supply by the motor diesel and the air and sound pollution it generated. Yet, Olacapato is a key example of the energy transition puzzle and the inequalities that holds, both for Argentina and beyond. Over there, you can see the solar plant from Olacapato, and you can see a better picture here. But this is most of the town, and you can see it from everywhere. So as you can see here, very close to Olacapato, Argentina inaugurated last year its largest solar plant and one of the largest in Latin America, Cauchari solar plant. The plant at 13 square kilometers provides 300 megawatts of electricity to the national grid and looms very close to the town. The mere 600 meters that separate the border of the town, with the beginning of the plant are not nearly enough to provide respite from the intense glare that the massive mirror produces. It is also not enough to avoid the loud humming that can be heard throughout the day. Yet the 600 meters are enough to constitute a legal boundary, a provincial limit that prevents the occupations from enjoying the benefits of the massive solar plant. Cauchari is in Jujuy province, Olacapato in Salta province. They are also materially prevented from connecting to this solar plant, as their electricity network is at the moment unable to connect to the energy generated there. While plans to create a small microgrid in one of the highest radiation areas of the world, this one exists, their lives remain, as I mentioned, connected to diesel-generated electricity. Further afield, but not very far, lies their salt flat, Salar del Rincón. At the moment, oh sorry, these are more pictures of the, you can see it in the back over there, and this is the salt flat. Further afield, but not very far, lies the salt flat, Salar del Rincón. At the moment, there are multiple lithium mining projects that are being developed, many of them by Australian companies. Well, the Australian companies that I interviewed insisted that the relationships with the communities are problematic, and based on cooperation, many people in the region remain unaware of what exactly are the projects and what are they useful for. They have little to no information as to what the impacts may or may not be in the area, but they suggested to us that some of the wetlands in the area are being dried because of the mining activity. They insist that there has been no consultation prior to the installation of the projects, yet they also look at them with hopes of partaking in some of the benefits of this white gold exploitation, with hope that this time they will be more capable to reap the benefits of mining in that area than they have been in the past. Many in Olacapato are unaware of the energy transition that the lithium from their salt flats may enable globally. And the community life develops in the tension between embracing the promises associated with lithium mining and the cautioning tales coming from the little information that they receive. Promises of progress and development in the emerging lithium industry become here key pieces in the construction of an imaginary of hope that connects dreams of a greener future in the global north, complete with futuristic electric vehicles leading the path, solar panels and home batteries sustaining electricity grids, to contemporary and concrete life in the lithium triangle. Beyond Olacapato, for many communities living on the sides of the salt flats, the imaginaries of transition that emerge from the lithium industry clash with their cosmovision and cultural practices that have shaped life in salt flats for millennia. While here the imaginaries associated to the energy transition are heterogeneous, they serve to remind us of the diverse ontological understandings of our natural and social world enacted in the visions of zero carbon futures. In many cases, particularly those that highlight the indigenous heritage of the area, they serve as a bridge connecting past, current, and future practices associated with everyday life in the salt flat. The questions that we're interested in is how do we articulate the messages embedded in these imaginaries, and what stories do they tell? Lithium as development, as white gold, as the key to lithium as the key to a greener future, lithium as part of a salt flat living ecosystem. How do we construct the imaginaries that will guide the energy transition, and what voices do they privilege? How do we enact them, and what do they mean for the different communities that are involved? How do we enter an ethical conversation that ensures that issues of environmental justice figure as prominently in our collectively held imaginaries of energy transition as do the socio-technical elements necessary to enable this very important zero carbon future. So on the way to work every day, I pass by this little shop. This is that sells solar panels, fueling the green gentrification of Melbourne's north. Yet, as Sheila just enough remind us, the imaginary of a zero carbon future calls on us today to plan for a world 1,000 years distant from our own. Spatially and temporally, imaginaries of the energy transition can help connect us all in our path to addressing the climate emergency. Understanding these imaginaries, the voices that they privilege, but particularly listening to the ones that they exclude, can become a powerful tool to catalyze meaningful climate action. I think they had some questions.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. So thanks, Anna, Jill, and Tim. We have a few questions, but I guess it's really interesting to look at the wide-ranging implications of loose or the lack of social and ecological protections, not just in Global South context, but also right here in our own nation state. So really interesting, I guess, for all of us. Could I, will the questions appear up here? Or?
I think they should appear. We can go into the chat for the Q&A.
So I'll let people at home take priority with their questions, and then if anyone else has got some.
So there's a question for Dr. Gregory. Says, could you expand upon how your work with the local research team in Colombia to continue research during the pandemic? What kinds of methods are you using, and what sorts of issues arose with this? I am asking as I've just started my second year of the PhD doing my fieldwork online, and any other panelists that would like to comment.
I'm sure you have something to say, Anna.
Yes,
Thanks for the question. It's certainly a challenge to do work remotely, as all of you can appreciate. I'm lucky enough to have had some time in Colombia prior to the pandemic, so I'm an adjunct professor at a university there, so I managed to assemble a research team with people I have been working with on a multi-year basis, which certainly has helped, because Anna has a sort of slightly different scenario. But she can probably...
So I have a lot of experience in working in Argentina, given that I lived the first 25 years of my life there. However, and I visited the area multiple times, however, I was not working on this project when I went. So I started by contacting my contacts in the area, and then did just an open call, got over 80 applications for my research position. And then from there started kind of, I was very lucky. I got really, really like very good people interested in joining the project. So I had like all postdocs were interested in being research assistants, which had been working in the area a lot in similar topics. And then I got in touch with this institution, this research institute that focuses on renewable energy, and they were very keen. So we've been working together since. It has been interesting, and really, I've also been waking up at like having interviews at like 2 a.m. with like local officials and like whatever. I also had an interview with some business person coming back from Argentina while they were in quarantine here in Melbourne after they went to manage their lithium mine. It was very interesting. Yeah.
I'm going to read a question that came through from the chat.
Oh,
is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
A question to you, Anna, from Janica. Is activism for closing mines a realistic solution, given that green technology will require even more extractive resources in the future? Is there any momentum within political establishment and civil society force large companies to manage mine better, which seems like a more realistic way forward? I think that came through during your presentation.
Yeah. I feel like maybe I wasn't very clear in when I was presenting. Not everybody is against the mines. Not all the communities are against the mine. They are definitely interested in partaking on the benefits of mines, of the mine expansion. Some people are very keen on that actually, and started opening like little restaurants or like places to eat, and at the very personal level and a lot of the communities are actually working in mining in there. However, there is also resistance that has been emerging, and there is, I mean, what Januka is proposing here is obviously the ideal way of how these things would happen, but in the reality, the capacity of both the national and the local state is very limited in terms of controlling the impacts of these communities. There is very little understood. I've talked to people like geologists and professors of regional ecology and like everyone that is working in the area. There is simply no data. They do not know how the alluvial fans in the area connect to each other. They don't know what is happening around the extraction and these evaporation ponds. They really don't know. They simply don't know. Like nobody knows. Nobody knows. The companies don't know. And this is obtaining this information and obtaining that level of regulation would of course be crucial and the central idea, but the capacity of both the state and the interest of the companies to pursue such expensive information is also small, for a lack of a better word, or close to, yeah, very limited. So yes, I think it would be great.
No. Oh, yeah, I thought you were going. There's one at the back. Can I? Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me about modern large-scale mining is the automation process, and there's less and less actual people involved in mining, so it feels like it's almost hidden from view because there's less witnesses. Now, remote sensing is one example of how you can look at it from a detached perspective, but it might be more of a team question. But how does it perceive in other places as well? Like, is it very much still a hands-on process in Colombia, or and globally? How does that fit?
My impression is that the mining industry likes to pretend it generates more jobs than it actually does. Yeah. It likes to pretend that they are longer lasting than they actually are. But certainly you do see differences in practices that are evident in satellite imagery between countries. You can actually see the effects of automation and the amount of machinery that they're using and what they have available. And that also affects the kind of impacts that they're having on surrounding areas too. So in some countries, for example, you can see where they dump waste rock over really large areas, and you can see them just as little piles over really large areas. Whereas in other countries, you can see they've gone to extreme efforts to stack them up really, really high and compact them so that they occupy as little area as possible. So what that actually means in terms of jobs or employment in the area, I can't really tell, but you can see differences in technology using. It could be implied that there's differences in employment as a result.
Yeah, the Chucky mine, the picture that I showed, that aerial footage of when I was in Chile, there were labor protests going on because they were actually closing that pit and moving most of the operations to an underground portion of operation and getting rid of thousands of jobs. And in Colombia, it's quite different, but in Chile, it really lines up with very strong labor movements that, particularly in that area, draw significant protest. And automation is growing, but it hasn't grown at the rate that people have been worried about so far.
In the case of the lithium mines, a lot of when I was saying that a lot of this is poorly understood in the area, and there is very little knowledge about the way in which these brines interact with the rest of the environment and etc. it's also true of many of these projects. I told you that there are 52 projects at the moment that are in various stages. Even the ones that are most advanced are still struggling to come up with the technology necessary to obtain the lithium carbonate from the brines, because it just simply, there isn't enough. One of the business people that I interviewed was mentioning that even what works in one end of the salt flat may not work in the other end of the same salt flat, not let alone what happens across the different salt flats in the area. Just because the composition, it's a very, the chemistry is very complicated. Apparently, to me, as a person who comes from social sciences, all this chemistry talk, I was like, yeah. Mm-hmm. But apparently it's a very, very complex process to actually separate the brine, the lithium, and obtain it from the brine. And it's very, so there is automation. There is also a lot of experimentation happening at the moment. And yeah, it's, they don't actually employ a lot of the people, and precisely because it is so complex, they cannot employ the people who live in the areas, because one of them was saying, yeah, we have people there, but the brains of the company are, of course, in Australia. And I was like, yeah, I don't know, whatever you're describing, I don't know how many people in the area that have barely have access to formal education would be able to, I don't know, manipulate this complex chemistry. It's just, there are so many challenges for those communities. It's just so hard. But it is also difficult to just accept or don't, or try to turn a blind eye to what it is, a new sacrifice zone for these people. And they are themselves very aware. The question that I wanted to is if there is any resistance, informal, formal, and organized. Yes, there is. These communities are organizing, and there are a lot of communities organizing, particularly indigenous communities. The area has a very high percentage of indigenous population, but there is a lot of organization. I took, because of time, the slide of one of the initiatives that they had that was very interesting. The communities had organized, because they had been excluded from most consultation. Actually, they insist, all of them, that there hasn't been any consultation. You talk to the companies and the government, there has been a lot of consultation. But one of the things that they did was they created this document that is called salt footprints, in which they took every stage of salt harvesting, the traditional salt harvesting, and connected it to a different stage of consultation. And they kind of developed their own protocol for consultation and said, like, to the companies, this is the way that we would like to ensure that everybody participates and that we have a say in what is happening here. But again, there is also, I mean, there are very material, concrete improvements for some people there. And some people want to benefit from that and want the formal employment, want to put on a little hotel to host the people there. I don't know.
Thanks everyone. It's now time. So yeah, thanks to our three speakers and everyone else for staying.
Thank you.